We are live. Well, welcome to another episode of the Reintroduction Podcast. I am your host, Chris Stefanos, and I'm here with my co-host, Mina Suiris. And we are excited today because we are wrapping up season 2 of the Reintroduction Podcast. And we're basically hoping to talk about a bunch of our main takeaways, kind of the point of the season, what it means to be human, and what we're going to do for season 3. So, Mina,
Well, it's been great.
tell me,
It's been
tell
a great
me.
season.
The guests that we've had on have been awesome, man. Like honestly, you and I have had to do zero because the people that we've had on have been amazing.
Absolutely. But I'll tell you something. Um, I was kind of thinking about this on the way home today is that I think, and we're going to go into this in a little bit more details later. I think season two is harder than season one,
For sure.
even though it doesn't make sense because season one, we talked about God and a reintroduction to God and how does God see man. And that was easier to talk about than it was to talk about human. And what does it mean to be human? Even though we know so much more about being human than being God. But I feel like it was more of a struggle. But more about that later. Um, you're gonna
So
say something.
so I totally agree with you. I think it's easy to philosophize about God, but when it comes to being human, you have to really speak not from theory or what you have read or what you know about, but from actual lived
Oh, you've lived.
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was the hardest part about it, is that
Yeah.
part of it was like an imposter syndrome. Is that, yeah, you can prepare a talk and you can prepare a lesson and get your thoughts in order. But a lot of the conversations we had were about real life sacrifices and real life living as an example of how God wanted us to live. And I think we can come and we can talk about it and we can struggle um, to live it out. But I guess that's part of being human. What it means to be human.
For sure, for sure. So Mina, maybe you can help us sort of tie in some of the loose ends. Like maybe some people are tuning in for the first time, or maybe people have tuned in sporadically throughout the season. What was the whole point of this season? What were we trying to do with the podcast this season?
I would say if you're tuning in for the first time, is where have you been
I
all
know,
season?
I know.
It's time to catch up on these episodes. We've had some phenomenal guests. We initially started the podcast because we wanted to reintroduce difficult um, topics and conceptions about misconceptions about who God is, and that's what we spent season one talking about. And the natural progression of that is that, okay, we talked about difficult conversations about the nature of God and who God is, but then what about us humans? Why would God create humans? What's His relationship with humans like? And what is the relationship between humans and humans like? And then what about the relationship between humans and everything that God created? And we hoped that this season we would kind of shed some light on that, and
Hmm.
what does it really mean to be human in light of um, God's vision for what He intended for humanity to be. And I think we kind of took it linearly. In the beginning, we talked about um, God, the creation of man, and what was man's response to that creation and the fall. Um, and then we kind of moved on from that. And we talked a little bit about identity and dignity, and that has a lot to do with how God intended to create man. Then we talked about man and man, humanity, and how does it deal with each other. And we talked about uh, work and why we need to work. We talked about how do we deal with other people when it comes to work. How do we deal with conflict,
Cancel culture.
cancel culture, and all of these kind of topics touched on that kind of relationship. We told between men and men, and we also talked about growth, and the potential of growth that God created in humanity. And we see that when we talked about marriage and we talked about singleness and relationships and how God can intend for us to have meaningful relationships and friendships and marriages that are meant um, to
To
take
make
us
us
to the
more
next
human.
level.
Yeah, and to make
Yeah,
us more human. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And we touched up on creation and why God created all this for us to enjoy and be part of and be honest partakers and stewards of the entire created order, and how when we abuse it, it's not a good reflection of who we are or who God is, and that's part of like our human process and our human growth. So I think, and at the end we talked about contentment, and that kind of just touches up on what is the goal of this journey,
Mm,
and part of it is to somehow figure out a way to attain joy through God. So I feel like we've done some reflections on it, but it was pretty difficult to talk about, to be honest. And I think some specific topics resonated, and spoke to me, um, with a heavier heart than others, I would
yeah.
say. What about you? What do you think?
I think it was definitely a very challenging season, so I totally can echo everything that you said. I think the episodes that really challenged me were the ones that were more related to kind of how we do what we do,
Mm,
like our relationships and our relationship with work, our relationship with creation, our relationship with um, kind of how we even view ourselves, like contentment and how we view the things that we purchase. The episode with Abuna Abraham and Dahlia, where we spoke to them about how to be faithful stewards with what God has given us with wealth. I think that was a super challenging episode for
yeah,
me,
absolutely.
um, because I think this season the folks that we had on were folks that really lived that which we asked them to
Mm,
speak about.
mm,
So when you encounter someone or people that are living that which you're not, it's sort of you come face to face with this like sort of this check, and you have to look at yourself and say, okay, why am I so off? Um, and I think that was the whole point of this season for me was like, how do I become what God has created me to be? How do I be like Christ was? Christ taught us what it means to be human by being
mm,
the perfect human, by
mm,
being totally empathetic, totally self emptying, totally self denying, totally giving of himself on a regular basis to those he encountered. And I think when we read about Christ or when we encounter Christ, he definitely checks us. But then when you come face to face with people that you see and that you know that are modeling Christ in a real and practical and tangible way, it's like, whoa, I'm really missing the mark. Like, I'm really off. And I think for those who are tuning in this evening, like, definitely go back, definitely listen to some of the episodes that we've had and the guests that we've had on from folks that have lived in war stricken countries, from those who have, you know, lived in places of poverty and doing mission. We've had some really amazing people on this podcast that really have demonstrated what it means to be
mm.
human. Um, so I think this season was definitely a challenging season. Uh,
Yeah, I think and not to basically like praise anyone or like may God protect them all and bless their work and their ministry and their lives, but just like you said, I think it does show when someone speaks on something with authority, that God has allowed them and has given them the grace to live out, um, certain things in their lives that emulate who God is.
mm,
Like you can care for your clients or care for your patients or care for your customers, um, or people that you interact with on a daily basis in a specific way that reflects who God is.
mm,
And that's not easy to do. And some days it's easier than others. And I think it takes a lot of reflection, daily reflection, to be able to do something like that. Um, and I think when I remember some of the episodes and going back, that's what kind of that resonates with me, is that we had people who have lived it in certain areas, like just like you said, and experienced it, and they can speak about it with authority. And we've had some episodes that I wish we could have probed more
yeah.
and we could have talked about more. Um, because but it was already a difficult conversation, and you have, and again, this is a reintroduction and we're not meant to like present an entire picture, but just to allow ourselves before anyone else to just come to these topics with a new mind and be like, let me explore that a little bit further and take something away from it.
Mm,
Like as an example, the episode when we talked about, hey man, can you spare some change? When we talked about poverty, like one thing that I took away from that episode, and don't ask me which one was my favorite episodes because they're all like my babies, right? You can't ask which one is your favorite because they're all great. But with this one in particular, I remember at the end of it, I said, okay, so if I look at my credit card statement at the end of the year and everything I have spent money on had to do with me, then I'm not living out the commandment. Like, because we talked about, oh, how much are you supposed to give, right?
mm,
What are you supposed to give? And like, okay, there isn't one concrete answer, there isn't a specific number. But then, yeah, when I look at myself and where I'm spending my money, if it's consistently for me and about me, then something is wrong with that picture. And
mm.
that's something that I need to dig in a little bit deeper and reflect on more, um, in order to unlock the potential of what it means to be human, the way that God has intended, um, for me to be. And I think that's, we all reflect on it. Yeah, you have a patient in the chair, or, um, are we seeing humans all the same?
Yeah, yeah,
That's kind of,
yeah. I mean, I think when you think about this, we've been through this journey for a year now. Like, we started
yeah,
season two a year ago. Like, we did season one in a fairly short period. We were doing episodes like every 2 weeks during COVID, even I think every week at a certain point.
yeah.
Uh, but season two, we've really spread it out. And when you think about where we started a year ago to today, um, I mean, it was quite the journey, talking about kind of where your brother is, talking about human dignity, talking about identity, talking about work, talking about human relationships and marriage and singleness and war and peace and cancel culture. Like, we covered so many topics that I think it's hard for you to pause and say which is the favorite, because all of them really resonated with me in that particular moment in time that really challenged me to think
Absolutely.
about where I was. Um,
So
and I
what
think,
does it mean to be human?
I mean, I always think what it means to be human is to emulate Christ. And when you think about what Christ did, was he self-emptied. He literally gave of himself in every possible way in order to lift humanity to where they ought to be. And if Christ, as Christians, we're called to be mini Christs, or we're called to be followers of the way, then the way that Christ showed us was the way of self-giving, the way of self-emptying, the way of pouring yourself out into everything that you do, the way of looking at people with dignity, seeing them the way God sees them, seeing them with their human potential.
Mm,
The way of Christ is doing everything with a heart that is sincere. So not going into work and not giving my all to what I'm doing, but doing it in the way that Christ did it when he was a carpenter. And I'm sure Christ was the best carpenter because he put his all in all into it. And then to think about in terms of like how Christ viewed those who were far off, like those who are living in sin and those who are, totally distant from what it means to be religious, how he encountered them. And through the encounters that he had with them, he he almost was like a stumbling block. He caused them to trip in where they were and sort of recalibrate and go in a different direction. So I think what it means to be human is to model what the prototype of humanity was, which is what Christ was. So
mm,
Christ looks at us with dove's eyes. Christ looks at us with the Christ looks at us with what we can be versus what we are. Christ looks at
mm.
us with human potential. And I think that's like the whole Orthodox journey, is to become, like, we're all human becomings. We're all becoming that which God has, created us to be through the grace of his Holy Spirit, that encourages us and motivates us to be that which he created us to be. So that's a very long answer to a
No,
question of
but
what it means
but
to be
it
human.
is very challenging in the culture that we live in, because to look at someone and consider them and love them and, think of them in terms of their potential is not something that we do on a daily basis. Like, no one considers potential.
Yeah.
We can, like, we learn, and we come up to think, no, this is where you are now. And this idea of like change, like you can sometimes say, oh, people don't change. But I think part of being human, and part of being what God has intended us to do, is to change. And even not to change, actually, maybe not to change, but to grow.
Mm.
Um, like I like the term when you talk about kids, we say raising kids, right? Like you have to take them, you help, yeah, you bring them up, you uplift them. And that requires um, going through mistakes, and whether they are deliberate or unintentional, or um, problems or blessings, or there's just so much effort that goes into raising kids and uplifting them and protecting them. And that's the same way that God looks at us, and being human has a lot to do with that process. Is that if at the end of the journey we have not grown, we are not raised, um, there is a problem. We have to learn from our mistakes. But I think that it does require that process of emulating Christ has to do with two very important components. And I think we covered in this season is that God has to be involved in the picture, and a community, a supporting community has to be involved. I don't think anyone is really capable of doing this on their own.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, because
Yeah.
it's not a journey of discipline; it's a
Yeah.
journey of growth.
And I think it was needed that we did season one, because
Yeah.
you can't know what it means to be human unless you know the character of who God is.
Mm.
Like, when I know who I am in Christ, I know how to view my brother. I know how to be in relationship with my brother. I
Mm.
know how to be a faithful steward in everything that I do. I know how to be a caretaker of my environment, and I know how to see life and the world with the lens that God sees the world,
Yeah.
right? But if I don't have a proper understanding of who God is, and my image of God is distorted, then my image of my brother will be distorted. And I
Yeah.
think, like, that's the crux of it. Like, we can't be human, like you said, Mina, without God, and we can't be human without a community to interact with. Because a human that's isolated is not really a person. He's just a fool sitting by himself
Mm.
in a room, right?
Mm.
Like, one only knows how to be a human when he has someone to interact with. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. And even when we talk about being human, we do categorize people in different categories when it comes to being human. Like we think, whether consciously or subconsciously, that some people are more human than others,
Mm.
and they deserve a certain sense of personhood than others. And we treat them that way. And we tend to want to categorize. Like, what about, okay, what is, if you ask like a philosopher, or like a neurologist, what does it mean to you to be human? They might say the ability to reason, or to develop language, and or to be able to read and write, that distinguishes us. Okay, what about a human being who can't read and write?
Mm.
Does that fall in the same, do you look at them the same way? What about a human being who doesn't have two legs and two arms? Do you look at them the same way? Like we lean towards abstract. We like categories, especially in the West. We tend to think of everything as categories. I was listening to Dr. Frederica Matthews, and she was talking about this book called The Cognitive Development, Its Cultural and Social Foundation. And the author of the book conducted an experiment where he would go into like remote villages in like developing countries, middle of nowhere, and he would conduct these experiments to assess the cognitive abilities of people who are uneducated or raised in like in an eastern small village community, as opposed to like the West. And the way they would do it is that they would show them four objects. He would show him like a hammer, a saw, a hatchet, and a log, a piece of wood. And he would say, which of these doesn't belong? And to the common like Western mind, it's so easy to say, okay, the hammer, the hatchet, and the saw, these are tools, right? These are one category. The log is its own category. But the people in the village didn't see that. They say, nothing here doesn't belong. Everything here belongs. Like the log or the piece of wood is essential for the tools to function. Like
Mm.
otherwise, why do you have tools to begin with, right? In a different experiment, they show them like a rifle, a dagger, a bullet, and a bird. And we can say, oh, these like everyone can categorize these as say, okay, the bullet, the rifle, and the dagger are like killing instruments. They belong in one category in the bird by itself. But the guys in the village were like, no. If you separate them, then who are you?
Mm.
What are you going to shoot with? What are you going to hunt with?
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to hunt? Um, and the Eastern mind, in a way, and the simple mind, um, the Norse mind, is thinking about not doesn't think in such abstract terms. No, it groups things together
Mm.
because everything does belong together. And the way we are supposed to look at human beings is the same way. We're not supposed to categorize humans in some social, um, professional, or whatever category that we do. It all belongs. We all belong in the same image of God.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I think we have a value-based system, right? And our value-based system is based on what people do. And that's how we categorize how much, like, you even think about society in the West, it's like your value is based on your net worth, right? Even
yeah.
like life insurance policies are taken out. Like the worth of a human is
Mm,
based on what their net worth is,
mm,
right? Or what their, like, if there was a lawsuit and some after somebody passed away, they basically combine what that they figure out what that person's potential earning power was, and that's what they value a life
yeah.
based on, which is
Yeah.
like crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like we see value in people based on what they do versus what we talked about earlier in the season, which is human dignity and human values
The
based
intrinsic
on the
value.
fact that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God, and
Yeah.
all of us are beloved by God, like actually beloved by God.
Yeah.
So when we see someone who we think doesn't have intrinsic value, so to speak, because they're not necessarily contributing in a
Mm,
great fashion towards society, that doesn't mean that they're less valuable. It means that they're less valuable in our um, sort of quantitative perspective,
right.
but it means that they're just as equally valued as the CEO who's a billionaire in the eyes of God, right?
Mm,
Like, and I think that's really radical in terms of our society.
yeah. Yeah. And that's so true. And that made me think of another question that when I asked myself and I said, what does it mean to be human? I paused for a second and I said, okay, why don't I ask myself, or why don't I ask a different question and see what the answer to that might be? And I said, um, what does it mean to be God if there were no humans?
Hmm.
Because like, and again, and I think if like, I'm not speaking from a theological point of view, because I know anyone who's listening to this from a theological perspective, like, what are you saying or whatever. I'm just saying, think about this from a human heart for a second, from God's heart. Forget theology for just a second, right? Because you say God is triune and Trinity and he's fully perfect and he's happy being by himself, right? But if God knew that when he created man, that man would fall and it would like have this all like cyclical issues and mistakes and sins and all this, and God would have to come and redeem it and all this stuff. Why would he still choose to create man despite all of that? Why would he choose to create? And I I mean, I just can't see it would I think God would say if humans are not here, it would suck. I think God would say that. I think God would say humanity adds so much value to what I've created here. And
Hmm.
if it weren't for them, life and creation would not be the same.
Hmm. Hmm. Controversial, Mina.
Right. Right.
I
I get
think,
again, not from a theological
yeah, yeah,
perspective.
yeah. I think what God would, from my lens of it, I think God wouldn't be God in a way, and
Yeah.
that's sort of controversial as well, because if God is love, then love must be inclusive.
Yeah.
It can't be exclusive. So God included us in that love, and God basically co-created the world with us to include us in that loving process, right? So that's like, it's super cool when you think about it. Like if you take a step back and you zoom out on this whole sort of intent of God, it's crazy. Like it almost makes no sense that God would create man knowing that man was going to fall. But that's the scandal of grace. Like that's the scandal of like what makes God who God is, that God is giving of
Yeah,
himself, knowing that he's going to sacrifice, knowing that he's going to empty of himself, knowing that he's going to redeem, and knowing that even those who he redeemed may still reject him, which is
absolutely. And
wild.
I don't think, and is maybe it may defy our current understanding of quantum physics and parallel universes, but I don't think there is a parallel universe or scenario where God could have not created man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I think however way you try to like philosophize or think about it, I think it was always intended that God would create man. It was
Yeah.
always part of his
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we are near and dear to God's heart so much that we're all valued the same in his eyes. And when we categorize each other, um, we undermine his initial creation for all of us.
Yeah. And I think for those who are tuning in again for the first time, please go back and listen to some of these episodes because again, it has nothing to do with Mina and I. Like the people that we've had on this podcast this season have really shared some super insightful things that I think will challenge the way you view what it means to be human and will make you kind of pause and say, okay, how does God view me and how does God view my brother and sister that I live with? Um, and
Yeah,
I,
and we ourselves need to go back and re-listen to some of these episodes to see
for
how we can
sure,
live better.
for sure, for sure. Um, so what's next, Mina? What are we doing next? What are we gonna do next season? Season three.
So we are going to be back for season 3, Chris.
We are gonna be back for season three, God willing.
All right, I think that's exciting. It's exciting and scary.
I mean, next season is gonna be probably the hardest season because it keeps getting harder and harder.
Keeps getting harder. So I think the natural progression is that when you talk about a reintroduction to who God is and then a reintroduction to humanity, um, who is God? What does it mean to be human? And I feel like season 3 might be then, and what does it mean to be a Christian?
Mm.
Because that is just like we've taken it in order in a way. And I think that is something, especially in the 21st century, with a lot that's happening. Um, it is highly controversial to be a Christian. It is highly controversial to know who a Christian is or what a Christian is. So I feel like that's going to be really, really cool and interesting to talk about.
And so many of us have misconceptions and misunderstandings of what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah, that you have to look a specific way,
Look a
act a
specific way.
specific way,
Yes,
dress a
yes.
specific way.
And I think we have to take a step back and zoom out and again see what it means to be a Christian through how God views the world and how God has shown us the way through Christ. So I'm really excited for next season because I think next season will also be incredibly challenging. And you guys need to be praying for us because we are in the process of formulating the episodes, finding the speakers.
Absolutely.
Um, so we won't be back just yet, like very fast. You might give us like a few months to kind of get things together.
Yeah.
Um,
But also on that, if you're like you hear the theme for the season and you say, okay, what does it mean to be a Christian? Some specific topics might come to your mind. Um, Send us a message, send us an email, and tell us, hey, I like the idea. I think it might be good for you guys to touch on this specific topic. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and incorporate them in our plan for the season. Because we've in the past we've gotten some tremendous feedback from all of you guys tuning in and listening, and we've benefited a lot from it personally, from your encouragement, but also it helped us plan future episodes. So we're all ears. Send us an email, send us a message, be like, hey, talk about this. We want to hear about this. We'd love to hear from you.
yeah, and I think we need that, right? If we have feedback from folks that are watching that are sort of asking certain questions about, hey, I'm struggling with what it means to be a Christian. Like, I'm struggling at when I look around and people identify as Christians, I sort of don't like what I see. We have to sort of strip away all the ideas that we have and again reintroduce what it means
Mm.
to be a Christian, because once we've reintroduced it, then every false idea or misconception that we have can be sort of sifted away, and then we can actually live the way God intends us to be and the way He showed us to live through His incarnation. So I'm really excited. I think it's gonna be great. We're gonna need a ton of prayer. We're gonna need a ton of feedback from you guys. And in the
Amen.
meantime, if you, like Mina said, if you have questions or you have things that you wanna, address, please send us an
Or just say
email.
hi.
Yeah, send us an email, send us a message, and we would love to hear from you.
We would love to, especially if you are struggling or you know someone who is struggling. If you feel like other Christians look at you in a specific way, or you are thinking about um, stopping being a Christian. You don't want to be a Christian anymore, and you feel like these are the reasons why I don't want to be a Christian. Tell us. Let's have a conversation. If you want to talk, let's talk. We would love to talk to
Yeah.
you. If you want to send us recommendations, send us recommendations. But honestly, we do care about this a lot, and I think season 3 is going to be challenging in a very good way to us, um, because we do understand and we know that it's not easy. Um, we live in the world where it's so easy to judge and mischaracterize and reduce other people and other humans. So let's do it. Let's do it. Let's hear from you. Let's get the season and let's get the show on the road for season 3 of the Reintroduction podcast.
Yeah. Well, Mina, thank you for another season, buddy. It's been an
Thank you,
honor. I've
Chris.
learned so much from you, man.
I know it's been really hard for you, and this is a bro moment. I know you just had, I mean, you've got your twins, and there's a lot that's happening. And for you to make the time among your services and work and everything else to be dedicated to this, I love you and thank you
Hey,
for
man,
taking the
I love
time. I
you. I
really,
learned so much from you every
me
single
too, man.
day.
Me too.
And I pray that God continues to bless you abundantly through everything that
And
you're
you
doing,
too, as
man.
my brother. And you
All
too,
right,
as my
guys, we'll see you next year or in a few months.
not
And
next year.
hopefully later
We're
on. And
still
yeah, maybe next year.
we're
It's,
in
it's,
May.
it's May. So maybe in a
Come
few
on.
months from now is
Come
next
on,
year.
Chris. Get on with it.
All right, we'll work on it as fast as we
Yes.
possibly can. But
Yes.
with that being said,
We love you.
we love you. May the peace and the love of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you, and we'll see you soon.
Tell them about Alexa.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. If
Come on,
you love
Chris.
this podcast, please
Yes.
subscribe to our YouTube page. If you would like to
Yes.
listen to it, you can find us on Spotify, you can
Mhm.
find us on Apple Podcasts, and you could also ask Alexa to play the reintroduction podcast for you. With
And I
that
need
being
some
said,
new AirPods.
yes, you need new AirPods. You're in
Yes.
10%. We
Yes.
love you guys. God bless you. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you guys next season. With that, peace.
Peace.